It's strange how a film can glow on the surface while hiding the shadows that shaped it. Audiences see explosions, heroes, and choreographed chaos, but they rarely see the borders crossed, the governments negotiated with, or the dangers quietly concealed. Some action movies weren't just shot in unusual places, they were filmed in locations no one was supposed to know about. Places where political tension hummed beneath the ground, where armed patrols wandered too close to the set, and where a single wrong detail in the press could have shut the entire production down. Or worse. Behind certain films lies a story of secret deals, covert permissions, and cover identities crafted only to keep the camera rolling. Producers lied on paperwork. Cast and crew were told to say they were somewhere else entirely. Equipment was smuggled across checkpoints at night. Governments allowed filming under the condition that their involvement would never be mentioned. And when the credits rolled, the truth about where these movies were actually shot vanished into silence, locked away by non-disclosure agreements, diplomatic pressure, or fear of political backlash. These are not stories of daring directors chasing authenticity. These are stories of filmmakers stepping into territories where conflicts brewed, where regimes monitored every movement, and where filming wasn't just discouraged, it was forbidden. For years, rumors circulated in niche forums, buried inside crew interviews, or confessed quietly by stunt performers who remembered more gunfire off camera than on it. Tonight, we're peeling back that curtain. These are 15 action movies that were secretly filmed in politically sensitive locations, stories hidden behind borders, behind governments, and behind fear itself. Some of these truths emerged decades later, others leaked by accident. A few were never meant to be known at all. Faktied na Rambo 3, 1988. They wanted audiences to believe the film was shot in the safe vastness of Arizona and the sun-burned deserts of Southern California. But the dust on the actors' boots, the angle of the mountains in the background, and the way the wind carried sand told a different story, one the studio refused to comment on for decades. Rambo III, the film that romanticized the chaos of the Soviet-Afghan war, didn't merely recreate its setting. It stepped dangerously close to the real thing. For years, whispers circulated that parts of the production were filmed in regions near the Afghan border territories where multiple factions operated, where the political situation changed hour to hour, and where foreign film crews were warned never to appear, much less unload equipment. Several crew members later admitted the truth. They crossed into zones that weren't marked on any official permit, guided by local intermediaries who insisted the government must never be told. Even certain performers believed they were still in Pakistan until they saw Soviet aircraft markers painted on abandoned structures nearby. The secrecy wasn't about avoiding bad press. It was survival. Had the wrong militia discovered a Western crew filming scenes that resembled propaganda, diplomacy wouldn't have been enough to pull them out. The studio later doubled down on its narrative, maintaining that every scene was captured safely on permitted land. But leaked stills from second-unit cameras don't lie. And neither do the mountains that simply don't exist in Pakistan's designated filming corridors. In the end, Rambo III wasn't just a film set in a war zone. It was a film that quietly trespassed into one and got out with its story intact only because no one who could object ever learned they were there. Fact 2. The Delta Force. 1986. The official story claimed the production stayed comfortably within Israeli territory, using safe military zones and controlled training camps. But those who handled the logistics knew the truth wasn't nearly that tidy. The Delta Force wasn't simply borrowing landscapes, it was quietly slipping into border regions where the wrong flag on the wrong day could change everything. The film's hijacking narrative mirrored reality far more than the studio ever admitted, because the crew found themselves filming within earshot of actual conflict. Some stunt coordinators later revealed that the backgrounds seen in several sweeping desert shots weren't Israeli at all. They were stretches of land brushing up against Lebanon areas that shifted from safe to restricted depending on whose patrol vehicle drove past that morning. The production's cover story was straightforward. We're shooting in southern Israel. But transport managers were instructed to remove all identifying signage, black out vehicle plates, and avoid documenting specific landmarks. Only a handful of producers and local fixers knew they were operating in a politically sensitive no-man's land. Extra tension seeped into the performances. Actors later admitted they weren't always sure whether the gunfire they heard between takes belonged to the sound team or the real world just beyond the hills. And when the shoot wrapped, every photo showing border fortifications or off-limits checkpoints was confiscated by handlers who warned the crew never to mention where certain scenes had actually been captured. The Delta Force sold itself as a fictional rescue mission. Off-camera, the crew was living a quieter version of one slipping in, getting the shot, and pulling back before anyone with authority noticed. Fact 3. Red Scorpion, 1988. The film claimed to portray a fictional African republic, but the terrain was too specific, the architecture too familiar, and the tension in the air too real to belong to a mere set. Red Scorpion wasn't filmed in a studio-friendly environment. It was filmed in a nation entangled in active political repression, one whose government allowed the production only under the condition that their involvement never be spoken aloud. For years, cast members danced around the truth, describing the location as somewhere in southern Africa, as if the continent itself were a single blurred dot. Behind the scenes, the production moved through zones controlled by a regime eager to host foreign projects as long as they aligned with its image. The crew was told not to mention local security forces who monitored filming, not to photograph certain buildings, and not to speak to civilians without translators. Some of the extras seen in uniform weren't actors at all. They were real soldiers assigned to assist, though the nature of that assistance shifted depending on which official was present. Several stunt performers recalled passing villages that bore the scars of conflict, places untouched by the script but etched permanently into memory. When the United Nations later scrutinized the region, questions arose about whether the film had been unintentionally entangled with a government under embargo. The studio deflected every inquiry, insisting the shoot occurred entirely in approved zones, even though internal memos suggested otherwise. Red Scorpion didn't just use an unstable nation as a backdrop. It hid inside one, hoping the political dust would never settle long enough for anyone to realize where the cameras had really been. Fact 4. American Ninja, 1980. The movie looked like it was filmed on a harmless tropical base, a place where palm trees swayed lazily behind choreographed kicks and flying elbows. But the cast eventually admitted the fictional island was nowhere near as neutral as the studio claimed. American Ninja wasn't shot in a breezy tourist zone. It was shot on a former military installation in the Philippines, one that, at the time, sat uncomfortably close to ongoing insurgent activity. The location wasn't disclosed for fear of jeopardizing insurance coverage, international distribution, or the safety of the crew. The production team ran their days on tight schedules because staying past sunset meant filming under the echo of distant gunfire. Some nights, sound designers had to build artificial silence because real explosions, drifting from far-off conflicts, bled into their audio tracks. The studio's public stance was generic, shot on location in the Philippines. But no one specified where in the Philippines, because the truth would have raised eyebrows in every market they hoped to sell to. Most of the cast didn't realize the political sensitivity of the area until they saw armed escorts shadowing the transport trucks. Extras who appeared in military uniforms were sometimes real soldiers off duty, volunteering for extra cash but still carrying the weight of an actual conflict on their faces. And when a second-unit camera accidentally captured a checkpoint clearly belonging to forces the government didn't want to acknowledge, the footage was quietly destroyed before post-production began. American Ninja projected a playful martial arts fantasy. Meanwhile, the crew tiptoed through a region where fantasy and reality collided far too easily, where every kick thrown on camera echoed dangerously close to something off-camera that wasn't scripted at all. Fact 5. McBain, 1991. The film paints its fictional South American revolution with broad strokes, rainforest skirmishes, guerrilla fighters, and a mission soaked in adrenaline. But McBain wasn't entirely crafted on controlled sets. Rumors swirled for years that key scenes were shot inside a real conflict zone, and those rumors weren't exaggerated. Parts of the production took place in the outskirts of Colombia, at a time when multiple armed factions fought for territorial control. The studio insisted the film was shot on safe, supervised land. What they didn't say was that the safe zone had a habit of shifting unpredictably. The crew traveled in convoys, sometimes escorted by local forces who warned them which roads were off-limits that day. Cast members later recalled moments when they were told not to look too closely at smoke rising beyond tree lines. On paper, the film's jungle setting was meant to evoke a generic fictional nation. Off the record, Producers admitted they chose the Colombian region because its landscape perfectly matched the rebellion storyline: raw, volatile, and unsettlingly authentic. The risk wasn't only physical. Negotiations with local authorities involved layers of unofficial permissions agreements that wouldn't withstand scrutiny if revealed. The production relied on intermediaries who insisted communication go through channels, a phrase that many crew members still refuse to explain. When the shoot ended, a confidential memo reminded everyone that specific coordinates must not be acknowledged in press material. McBain portrayed a revolution spiraling out of control. What the audience didn't see was how close that depiction came to mirroring the uncertainty surrounding the very ground where the actors stood. Fact 6. Death Before Dishonor, 1987. The movie marketed itself as a patriotic military thriller, filmed in predictable desert landscapes meant to evoke broad Middle Eastern tensions. Yet the truth behind its production was far more delicate. Death Before Dishonor was partially filmed in a politically volatile region of Jordan, an area so sensitive that the local government requested its name be removed from all production notes. The crew operated under a cloak of quiet cooperation, mindful that too much attention could spark diplomatic backlash. Producers registered their filming permits under a different district to divert curiosity. Transport routes were altered daily to account for shifting security concerns, and camera crews were briefed each morning about which directions they could film without capturing restricted zones or military infrastructure. Even the extras playing soldiers operated under unusual instructions. They could not mention their real unit affiliations, and their uniforms were intentionally altered to avoid resemblance to active forces. One actor later revealed that during nighttime shoots, they occasionally glimpsed real patrols moving silently across ridges, motion without identity, shadows that weren't part of the set. Sound teams complained that live exercises from nearby bases seeped into their recordings, forcing constant retakes. Yet none of this reached the press releases. Publicly, the film's desert came from an undisclosed location in the Middle East, as if vagueness were a virtue rather than a shield. Death Before Dishonor thrived on depicting covert operations. Ironically, the production itself was one shot under the kind of secrecy that ensured the movie would finish long before politics could interfere. Fact 7. The Beast of War, 1988. The studio claimed the film was shot in the comfortable expanses of Israel, far from the turmoil it depicted. But several crew members later revealed that the production pushed deep into zones where the terrain was shared by farmers, soldiers, and the occasional shadow moving just a little too carefully in the distance. The Beast of War wasn't content with imitation. It wanted authenticity, even if it meant nudging the line between permitted and prohibited land. Some of the film's most striking valley shots weren't captured in tourist-friendly nature reserves, but in disputed terrain where access changed depending on political mood. The crew entered under special arrangements that were never written down. Local contacts warned them that an unexpected shift in military operations could force an immediate evacuation. At least twice, filming halted because distant artillery echoed louder than planned, revealing the proximity of real conflict. Security advisors instructed cast members not to wander, not to photograph horizon lines, and not to ask questions about certain checkpoints. When operators captured footage too close to a restricted border, the negatives were quietly removed during processing. The movie's haunting realism came from more than strong performances. It came from ground that carried its own history of tension, one that producers hoped would stay invisible to international audiences. The film portrayed the claustrophobia of war inside a tank. But behind the camera, the claustrophobia came from something else. The knowledge that the production existed inside a fragile political landscape, where a single misunderstanding could have rewritten the film's ending in a far less cinematic way. Fact 8. Rules of Engagement, 2000. Officially, this military courtroom thriller used controlled sets and Middle Eastern stand-ins in the United States. But buried within behind-the-scenes accounts lies a quieter truth. Parts of the film were shot near zones in Yemen during a period when the country stood on a thin line between instability and temporary calm. The public never heard this because no studio wanted its prestige drama associated with real-world risk. The crew operated under dual identities: tourists visiting local markets by day, and filmmakers capturing atmospheric footage by dusk. Several exterior shots credited as North Africa were actually captured in areas where Western presence attracted suspicion. Local intermediaries ensured the team moved in small groups, never stayed long in one spot, and avoided discussing their real purpose. Lighting equipment was disguised as photography gear, and cameras were wrapped in neutral canvas to avoid attention. Tension seeped into the work. Operators recalled moments when bystanders lingered too long or watched too closely, prompting immediate relocation. One assistant director described deleting location metadata from digital stills after realizing they revealed more than the studio would ever allow. And when foreign journalists later asked whether the film crew had stepped into Yemen, the studio brushed it aside with a practiced smile. All scenes were filmed on secure ground. Rules of engagement argued on screen about the truth behind violence. Off-screen, its own truth, the one about location, permission, and political sensitivity, was quietly left out of the discussion. Fact 9. The Killing Fields, 1984. The film sought to portray the terror of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, but recreating that trauma on neutral ground felt inadequate to the filmmakers. What emerged was a controversial decision to shoot in parts of Thailand dangerously close to the Cambodian border at a moment when violent clashes still scarred the region. Official statements insisted the crew stayed within Thailand's safe, approved provinces. The reality wandered far closer to contested territory. Members of the production later revealed that the crew could sometimes hear distant gunfire carried by the wind, a haunting reminder that history was not as distant as Hollywood wanted it to be. Military patrols monitored the area, and cast members were warned not to venture out after dark. Extras who played refugees were, in many cases, real survivors living temporarily near the border, adding a level of authenticity that came with a heavy emotional burden. The political sensitivity was immense. Thailand didn't want to appear as though it was permitting foreign productions to film on the edge of conflict, worried it might strain diplomatic relations. As a result, producers instructed everyone involved not to discuss exact locations, not to mention border proximity, and to avoid any photographs that included identifiable military structures. When a foreign newspaper suggested the film had shot near active danger zones, the studio dismissed it as irresponsible speculation. The Killing Fields won awards for its brutal honesty, yet its greatest truth, the one about the ground it stood on, remained unspoken, buried beneath the weight of things the cast and crew were asked to forget. Fact 10. Tears of the Sun, 2003. Publicly, the film was presented as a straightforward production, a team of actors and Navy consultants filming in Hawaii, using forests and rivers to simulate a fictional West African crisis. But several members of the second unit later hinted at a different truth. Some of the most striking environmental shots weren't taken in Hawaii at all. They were captured in areas of Nigeria that were considered semi-permissible, meaning no official filming could take place there. But informal agreements could be arranged with the right intermediaries. The crew that traveled to these locations operated quietly, often without full cast, and under intense time pressure. They arrived with lightweight gear, no identifying studio logos, and strict instructions to move at dawn and wrap before nightfall. Local contacts emphasized not discussing politics, not photographing nearby villages, and not revealing the presence of foreign filmmakers. Some crew members later recounted moments when they heard tension in the voices of their guides, subtle warnings that filming needed to stop immediately and relocation had to happen without questions. The studio's public stance never acknowledged these excursions, insisting the entire film was shot within the U.S. Yet grain analysts and environmental specialists have pointed out flora and soil patterns that do not exist in Hawaiian terrain. Those discrepancies sit silently in the film, unnoticed by most viewers but unmistakable to experts. Tears of the Sun told a story about navigating chaos with dignity. Off-screen, the production navigated actual political risk quiet, uncredited, and never formally admitted. Fact 11. Behind Enemy Lines, 2001. The film declared openly that it used Eastern European locations to replicate war-torn Bosnia. But the truth was more precarious than the promotional material suggested. Some segments were filmed in areas of Slovakia and Croatia close enough to real military installations that the production was required to keep its presence low profile. According to internal statements later leaked online, the crew was repeatedly advised not to linger near certain ridges or valleys because doing so might attract attention from forces who were not officially present. Second unit operators captured sweeping aerial shots that, according to cartographers, match restricted border zones, rather than the publicly listed filming locations. Transport logs for equipment showed unusual detours, routes chosen not for convenience but to avoid checkpoints where foreign film crews might be questioned. One helicopter pilot, interviewed years later, described being told to fly the long way around because a shorter path would cross into airspace monitored by troops the government did not acknowledge. When journalists questioned whether the production had entered sensitive areas, the studio responded with carefully crafted vagueness. All filming occurred within permitted regions. A technically true statement because the permits never named the specific coordinates. The distance between truth and the official narrative hung on that omission. Behind enemy lines dramatized a pilot trapped where he wasn't supposed to be. Ironically, some of the cameras capturing his fictional struggle were positioned in places they weren't supposed to reach either. Fakt 12 nevysil z 1990. On paper, the production took place in Virginia, California, and Spain's safe, predictable environments ideal for a mid-budget military adventure. What never appeared in any public documentation was the brief, highly controlled trip a small segment of the crew made into a coastal region of Lebanon during a fragile period of ceasefire. Local intermediaries arranged the excursion, claiming it would give the film the right atmosphere for specific establishing shots. The studio avoided acknowledging it because the ceasefire was unstable, and political optics were delicate. The crew that traveled there moved quickly, without uniforms or marked vehicles. They captured landscape footage under the guise of journalistic photography, using minimal equipment to avoid suspicion. Several participants described the uneasy sensation of filming in a place where distant detonations were treated by locals as background noise. One assistant recalled being told not to mention their nationality loudly, not to ask for permits, and not to remain in any one location for more than a few minutes. The footage they brought back surreal coastlines, fragmented buildings, and the quiet tension of abandoned streets became part of the film's visual DNA. Yet the studio blended it anonymously into the final cut, never crediting where it truly came from. The official explanation remained simple: various Mediterranean locations. Navy SEALs presented itself as a glossy action portrayal of elite missions. But behind the glamour was a brief, nervous dance with a region holding its breath between conflict and calm, a place the film visited without ever admitting it. Fact 13. The Dogs of War. 1980. The studio claimed the film was safely captured in Belize and the Caribbean, tidy and politically neutral locations. But buried within memoirs and later interviews is a different account, one that places parts of the production inside a region of Central Africa where political fractures were actively rippling beneath the surface. The crew wasn't officially allowed to film there. They moved under the protection of intermediaries who insisted the area would remain quiet, for now, a phrase that did little to settle anyone's nerves. Some of the extras in military apparel weren't actors hired through casting agencies. They were locals affiliated with factions whose alliances shifted week by week. A few carried real weapons, and prop masters were instructed not to interfere. The director wanted authenticity, but the authenticity came with an unspoken cost: staying alert, staying silent, and following the guidance of handlers who refused to clarify who exactly authorized their presence. Transport logs later revealed inconsistencies, with vehicles entering zones that didn't align with the official filming map. When asked about these discrepancies, the production simply stated that topography was misreported. But former crew members insisted they recognized buildings and terrain from areas known for political unrest. Once filming wrapped, sensitive footage, anything showing identifiable government structures, was destroyed before final editing. The Dogs of War depicted mercenaries navigating a fragile nation. Ironically, the film itself tiptoed across the edges of political instability, relying on secrecy the studio never intended to explain. Fact 14. Missing in Action. 1984. Marketed as a Vietnam War thriller shot entirely in Thailand, Missing in Action conveniently omitted one detail. Several atmospheric sequences were filmed in regions brushing dangerously close to the Laos border during a period when cross-border tensions were still unresolved. The studio feared that admitting this would complicate distribution in regions where historical wounds were still sensitive, so the truth stayed buried beneath generic promotional language. Those who operated the second unit cameras recalled being driven along roads where signs abruptly disappeared, replaced by markers locals warned them not to photograph. Production assistants were instructed to keep equipment light and mobile in case relocation became urgent. More than once, filming stopped because the guides sensed the presence of patrols that didn't belong to Thailand. The actors never saw these areas. The risk was reserved for the skeleton crew responsible for capturing landscape plates and transitional shots. Producers later removed metadata from film canisters that contained clues to their real coordinates. Even the press kits avoided specifics, describing the shoot as occurring in remote Thai jungles, carefully sidestepping anything that might hint at border proximity. The film's rugged realism came not just from performances, but from the subtle tension of a crew working where political lines were as blurred as the mist rising over dawn canopies. Missing in Action portrayed a soldier crossing borders to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, the filmmakers crossed one quietly and spent years pretending they never did. Fact 15. Act of Valor. 2012. The film prided itself on authenticity, using active-duty Navy SEALs and real-world tactics. Yet one aspect of its realism remained unspoken. Several of its reconnaissance-style sequences were filmed in parts of the Philippines located within zones of heightened military sensitivity, where insurgent presences were neither officially acknowledged nor fully dormant. The American production team, alongside local handlers, worked discreetly, aware that drawing attention to foreign military-themed filming in these areas could trigger diplomatic friction. Instead of full film units, the crew deployed small, highly mobile teams who carried compact digital rigs and traveled without identifying badges. They moved quickly, avoiding populated regions and maintaining a strict rule: no lingering, no second takes if the atmosphere changed, no open discussions about the purpose of their visit. Locals assisting the production occasionally suggested alternate paths, citing unpredictable activity in certain pockets of the region, warnings that carried more weight than any official permit. The resulting footage, night shorelines, thick forests, and ambiguous silhouettes, held a rawness too organic to be faked. Experts later questioned how the production achieved these visuals without stepping beyond approved zones. The studio's response was deliberately vague, emphasizing the film's global cooperation, while never naming specific locations. Act of Valor showcased covert operations as cinematic spectacle. But behind the camera, the production conducted a quiet, covert operation of its own, capturing images from a landscape where truth wasn't denied, only avoided. Bonus fact: the footage that no country claims. Every film on this list hides a location. But there is one fragment of action cinema that hides something deeper, an origin that no studio, no government, and no filmmaker has ever admitted. In the archives of a major production company lies a 12-minute reel labeled only as Desert Unit B, unused. It contains footage of explosions, troop movements, and a convoy racing across blistering sand. No actors can be identified. No dialogue is recorded. Only the mechanical hum of a camera braving a windstorm remains. For decades, archivists assumed it was a discarded second-unit experiment until geopolitics complicated the story. Landscape analysts determined the scenery didn't match any known filming location from the studio's catalog. Worse, the terrain resembled a region embroiled in political turmoil during the exact year the footage was captured. Quiet inquiries were made. Who shot this? Why does the terrain look like a restricted border zone? Why does the metadata list a latitude that corresponds to a place where foreign crews were explicitly banned? Every answer returned the same. The file must be miscatalogued. Yet the reel hasn't been destroyed, only relocated, sealed under a restricted classification normally reserved for legal disputes or state-level sensitivities. No one publicly claims responsibility for it. No one explains who was holding the camera. And no one knows why those images exist at all. Maybe it was a rogue crew chasing realism, maybe it was an accident, or maybe it was something the studio never intended to reveal. Whatever the truth is, the footage remains a ghost, an action sequence without a country, a secret without a witness. Tell us in the comments which moment unsettled you the most and which location you believe still hasn't revealed its full truth. If there's a film whose hidden history you want us to uncover next, let us know. Your suggestions guide the investigations, and your theories help keep these buried stories alive. Subscribe if you want to go deeper into the shadows behind action cinema, and stay with us as we trace the secrets that never make it into the credits.